Okay. Well, I sent out questions this week, not a lot of them because we're going to cover several chapters, but I think there's still some important messages in some of these chapters. We're obviously not going to do every verse by verse, but we are going to try to hit the highlights and kind of address the applications of some of these chapters to our thinking and understanding as we go. If you remember last week, we had finished up with the speeches by the friends, and the more and more you read through the book of Job, the more and more it does emulate a court type setting. We talked earlier on about how Job constantly was seeking his day in court, but this has really kind of been a lot like a court setting where the prosecutors would make their case and then the defense would get their chance, and then the prosecutors again, and go back and forth, and there were opening arguments, and now there's going to be closing arguments and stuff, and it's going to be Job's summary defense in these next 5 chapters. So thought it was interesting that either they were really good at predicting what court settings were going to look like, or our court settings have really kind of taken on the imagery and the methodology that was in ancient times and in the Bible. So kind of amazing that some of the things are like that. So in chapter 27, Job starts out by continuing to maintain his integrity. And it kind of seems like that, Job was waiting for his friends to reply one more time, but then since Zophar didn't speak up and held his tongue, Job just kind of continued on from chapters 26 and straight on into 27. So he's like, well, they're letting up. I'm going to keep going. And he starts to build up some strength as he's going through some of these chapters, and he's starting to put a fine point on a lot of things. But in the previous chapter, Job had talked a lot about the power of God, and I think it's throughout all of this, Job has always pointed out that he really needs something more than just the might of God. He was wanting the God to actually give him some justification and everything, and make things right, and show his friends and everybody else that he didn't deserve a lot of these things. And there's a few verses in there that Job makes some pretty strong statements, and it's some of those statements, I'm not going to bring them up yet because they're kind of the point of some of the questions. But once he makes these statements, you would think that those statements that he made would have put a final end to this wager. And we'll talk a little bit later about how much time has really passed and different things in this, because there's a couple of verses in here that might give us a little bit of a light on that, because we don't know if these conversations have taken place over hours, days, weeks, months, or what, but there's a few little hints. Verses 7 through 10, Job also makes some very strong statements that he's asking for the same punishment that his friends thinks he deserves should be put upon them, because in his mind, they're making false accusations. And if you go back and look a little bit at Israelite law, if somebody accused you of something in ancient times falsely, and it was proven that you were in the right and that they were false, then whatever punishment would have been enacted on you gets enacted on the people that had falsely accused you. So he's suggesting that, they brought up all these blanket statements of you've stolen from the poor, and you've stolen land, and you haven't treated people right, and for all of that you need to be punished, Job. So he's saying, look, I didn't do any of those things. To the contrary, I've done the exact opposite. So by all rights and everything, God and humanity, you should be passing these punishments onto my accusers. And so it was kind of interesting that maybe that's why they got quiet all of a sudden. They were finally starting to realize that, you know what, we might have gone too far here. So it's almost like they're backing off in the hopes that, but looks like it's too late that Job has realized this and is now affirming it as part of his defense. Job also declares that he would teach his friends about the hand of God and more about God, because he's practically took hold of all that they had said about God's visitation on the wicked, and he hurled it back on them now in his defense. He's kind of insinuating that, yeah, you're partly right about God's rules and policies and everything on the wicked, but that doesn't apply to me. And so now he's turning it around and using it against them instead. Job also argued strongly that judgment awaits the wicked man, and that he will not ultimately be blessed. And by he's talking about the wicked man, that even if he does make it till the end, throughout his mortal life and doesn't get punished, he's still going to get punished at the end. And this is some verses that we say, are getting kind of repetitive, whether they were told by the three friends or Job. We still see a lot of the same statements and claims in these final chapters. Job then kind of goes on to describe many things that happen to the wicked. Some, if not most of these things did indeed happen to Job in his crisis, but he's not suggesting that because they happened to him, it's an admission of his guilt. He still stands strong throughout this whole thing that he's not guilty. These shouldn't have happened to him, and but for most, this will happen. And instead, Job's idea was, I know that my situation looks like the judgment of God on the wicked, yet I assure you that it is not. So again, he's disputing the whole cause and effect type argument that you would traditionally see for most wicked people. So the first question that I had sent out says, what promise did Job make in chapter 27, verse 4? And how did he emphasize it in verses 2 and 3? He kind of puts a reinforcement in there as well too. So did anybody have a interpretation of the best way to answer this question? Well, this is
no longer.
Go ahead.
He would no longer speak wickedness, and he would utter no deceit.
Yeah, I think this was his summary statement that he's been making all along. But after all he's been going through, he's lost all of his material goods. He's lost his children, his family. He's probably lost some of the love and the attention of his wife. He's lost the respect of his friends. He's lost the respect in the town and the city. And throughout all of this, he's lost his health. He's been having, itching, scratching, infections, you just about everything you can think of. And he's never once cursed God as the test would say he would, Satan alluded to. And here it is at the end. He's still saying, I will never, ever. And I took this as I'm never going to speak wicked or deceitful towards God or about God. That, and I think the emphasis is the previous verses. He kind of establishes that even though he's given me every reason to, I am not going to speak negatively. And so I think that's the emphasis on it, is that I've got every right to probably speak in the worst of terms about my situation God himself as the devil or Satan thought he would, but he's saying, I'm not going to do it. So you kind of wonder, is this the point in the book where the devil and God both agree that, okay, this test is over? And so don't know if anybody else has anything else to add, but that was my interpretation, and you hit right on it, Terry.
This is where he first starts to truly defend himself. I mean, right? It says, "Far be it from me that I should say you were right." So I'm liking that aggressiveness.
Right. Yeah, that's kind of going into the next question. It says, what did Job affirm in verses 5 and 6, and what connection did this have to the discussion? So you stated it, Dave, that he said, far be it from me to affirm you are right. I mean, he's not giving in. He's not, some people may break and say, I don't know what I did, but here's my repentance no matter what. But Job never once felt like he had anything to repent for. He's been pretty steadfast throughout this whole thing, but he never once gave in or tended to agree with his friends. And so he wouldn't give up his integrity in order to say, yeah, you're right. So in his mind, his friends were the hypocrites and not himself. And but had he given in and repented of something he never did, well, then that would probably make him a hypocrite as well, correct?
Yeah. I have the NLT and it says, I will never concede that you're right. I will defend my integrity until I die.
And he thinks he's getting ready to die at any minute, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he's this whole thing says, death is at my feet. I can see the grave and stuff. And I just wish that I could get my justification before I die, but he thinks he's getting ready to die. So, some people that were getting ready to die might, just give in just in case. So Job never did throughout any of this. I don't remember, I talked a little bit about time. I don't remember which chapter it was, but everybody's Bibles are a little bit different. But one of these chapters, I think it's chapter 30. Let me see. Well, mine doesn't start out with it, but I think it's chapter 30 in some Bibles talks about, he kind of references in months past, it's when he was kind of going over all the things that were right with him. Maybe that was in 29. Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
verse
so
2.
29.
Verse 2 in chapter 29 says, "Oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me." And I was trying to make the connection of, is he trying to say that in the past couple of months, God watched over me? Or is he simply making a reference to a period of time some time ago? I mean, it could have been months, a year ago. I don't know, but it kind of led me down the path that it hasn't been that long ago that, perhaps this test has only been going on for a month or two. It's hard to believe that these friends would still be there that length of time, but
Yeah.
I kind of grabbed a hold of that and thought that might give us a little bit of an idea of how long this whole ordeal has been going on.
Well, my Bible says, I long for the years gone by.
Okay.
So that kind of indicates it was way former.
Mhm.
And that then you would think he was speaking of a period of time,
Right.
like my younger years or something like that. Not as
Mhm.
it's obviously, I don't think anybody thinks that they've been there for 2 years hashing this out. So, but yeah, it's interesting how almost every you would think there would only be one interpretation of the Hebrew text and stuff. So it's interesting how different Bibles come up with completely different scriptures sometimes for different phrases.
Mhm.
So
Well, I'm glad, Ken, that you brought up the issue of time, because I was wondering about that this week. Have they just been sitting there talking to him? His house was gone, all his crops were gone. Wouldn't you want your friends to get up and say, hey, let's, find you some clothes, let's find you a place to stay? It doesn't sound like they're doing anything except for sitting there talking to the poor man.
that's a good point. So many of these chapters talk about helping the poor and the naked and the penniless and things like that. And that kind of describes Job. But yeah, you're right. Nobody's really trying to help him out. I guess just because he's not a widow or an orphan. But yeah, it is interesting. And yeah, you don't think it's been a long time, because he still talks about how he still has his skin afflictions, and he's still dealing with his pores and his boils and everything else. So and I like the references of time as well too, because when we're done with this chapter, I'm going to kind of give you my conclusion of how time plays a role in all that we've learned and all that we can anticipate. So keep that in mind, that I do think that time does have an important role in this discussion, but I'm not ready to give it yet.
Do you think that this is an absolutely continuous discourse, or do you think that it could be broken at times?
Well, it's hard to tell, because it almost seems to be continuous, because
Yeah.
it's like no longer do they shut up, that he jumps right in, and then as soon as he stops talking, well, then they jump in, and it kind of gets heated,
Yeah.
as they go along. And you would think that if they had gone home, or they were coming back on the weekends or whatever, you would think that there would be these cooling off periods or these calming periods where they would say, well, maybe I shouldn't say that. So I'm kind of leaning toward, this is a debate, an ongoing debate that hasn't ended until now. So
Okay.
they didn't have email back then, so
No.
it might have been even more heated if they were back at their home places and using the internet, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Because the internet adds a stupidity factor to everything you transmit. And it's like, that's not what I meant. So, okay, chapter 28 then is Job's discourse on wisdom. And some of the commentators that I had read on and that kind of stuff, some wonder if this chapter and its place in the book really was something that Job said, or is this something that whoever, as we've talked about, a lot of people believe that Moses wrote this chapter as well too, kind of as his practice for when he was going to write, some of the more important chapters earlier. But there's some discussion about this chapter almost doesn't sound like it belongs in Job, that maybe it was added by an author at some point, because it has a whole new tone to it and that kind of stuff. And it seems too calm and too thoughtful, really, to be written by either one, Job or his friends. But so like I said, some don't believe it belongs in here at all. But for the purposes of our discussion and the way it's written, I think we're kind of led to believe that these are Job's words and that this is Job's discourse. So until we're proven wrong, that's what we're going to stick with. So Job starts out by explaining how diligent and desperate men can be as they seek precious useful gems and metals. He talks about mining and different things. And it's interesting that in these times, there's a pretty good discussion and knowledge of mining. And some of the things I've read too says that, there's not much in here that's written that really isn't believed in natural times when it comes to geology and that kind of stuff too. So it kind of proves that, Job is still pretty knowledgeable in almost all things of the world. As we talked last week, there were some insinuations that he knew about the spherical nature of the earth and the circular horizon and different things. So it's interesting that somebody back in these times had such a grasp on the sciences and things, because a lot of us are led to believe that, the true understanding of science and physics and things like that didn't really happen until, ancient Roman and Greek times. But Job seems to have a pretty good handle on it. Job asserts that, men search hard and are willing to endure danger for the sake of the riches of the earth. He kind of describes how they could hang from a rope and swing to and fro while they're mining stuff out of the sides of hills and cliffs and caves and so on. But he goes on to say that, all of that is still pretty easy compared to the search for wisdom. And Job describes where wisdom cannot be found, and he also describes how it cannot be obtained. And I'm not going into too many details because that's one of the questions, but Job explained how hard it was to find this wisdom, and then he asked the logical question. And Job knew that he needed to find this precious wisdom, and he certainly knew that his friends needed it even more than he did. It's like they constantly talked like they had a handle on all this wisdom and everything, but Job still felt like they didn't have a grasp on it at all, and that it would eventually come with some certain things. And so Job concludes this speech by establishing a link between wisdom and a person's faith with God himself. So question 3 then says, where can wisdom not be found and how can it not be obtained? And he's talking specifically about verses 14 and 15.
Found in the wisdoms of the earth. And God's not going to reveal that wisdom to everyone.
Yeah, he says it
could,
go ahead, Dee.
it says, my Bible says it cannot be found among the living. That's in verse 13. And then it says, it's not here, says the ocean, or is it here, says the sea, and it can't be bought with gold or silver. So it's kind of hard to find.
Yeah, it's basically, it's not a physical thing. It
Right.
As you said, it can't be found in the land of the living. It can't be found in the deepest parts of the earth. It can't be found at the bottom of the ocean. And even if it could, even if you could find it in those places, you can't purchase it or trade for it or barter for it. It's not something that you can simply gain through physical means, so to speak.
Right.
So are they comparing wisdom to faith? Is that what we're looking at here?
Well, I think that's where we're heading.
Okay.
Yep. You might have answered the next question. I don't know.
Bonus points.
Well, and then this one kind of took me a while to really make this linkage and that kind of stuff. But the question said, what is the meaning of the phrase fear of the Lord? And in verses 28, because the phrase fear of the Lord doesn't really seem to link or tie to this, but I think there's some other scriptures in the Bible that kind of make that connection. So I'll just see if you've kind of headed in that direction, Pam. So finish it.
Well, but that wasn't what I had. That wasn't how I answered the question. Because I mean, to me, fear of the Lord isn't fear of the Lord. It's reverence for the
Right.
Lord. It's to realize who he is. That's what I think of when I see those words. But I just now, I guess, obviously, when I was reading this, I didn't think about wisdom being faith. And no, it's not from the living, because God gives us the faith. So,
Well, I'll try to summarize it, because I think I was like you, where I was like, okay, what does fear of the Lord really mean here, and what does it have to do with wisdom? And these are not my words, but I found one commentary that said, since true wisdom comes from God, I think we've said it's not a physical thing you can obtain, so it's obviously spiritual and in nature, and that can only come from one source. So since true wisdom comes from God, it is found by being in right relation to him. In other words, the fear of the Lord, and it is shown by a life that does depart from evil. So, wisdom, there's knowledge, which is book smart, and all the things that Job knows about physics, and all the things that all of these friends know. And here's what our fathers taught us, and that kind of stuff. They've sometimes have taken knowledge and put it out there like it's wisdom, but true wisdom can only come from somebody that is in that right relationship with God. And in order to be in that right relationship, you have to look up to the Lord, or fear of the Lord, and understand the Lord, and anything that will happen. And the application of that is living the right life. And Job had taken in all of that wisdom, and he had led that correct life all of his time. So it seems like Job was probably the one person out of all of this that really did understand how wisdom played into life in general. So I don't know if that helps. If anybody else has any other interpretations that could also apply here or not. Well, hearing none, we'll move on to chapter 29 so we can hopefully get through these today. Chapter 29, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on 29 and 30, but chapter 29, Job remembers, kind of goes back in time. And as we talked about, for whether it's months or years, he kind of goes back in time before he lost all of his children, his health, his wealth. And he longs for the time mainly when he felt like God was watching over him. There was a time that he thought God was over his tent, or looking out for him and blessing him with prosperity and so on. And now he thinks those days are gone. He said Job fondly remembered the days when it seemed that God was for him rather than against him. And Job's great crisis after his catastrophic losses was primarily spiritual. I can't remember once when Job lamented losing all of his livestock or any of those kind of belongings, so to speak. He did lament about his family, I believe, and his health. But for the most part, he laments that he's lost touch with God, and he doesn't feel that connection anymore, and that's what troubles him more than anything. So he's remembering what it was like before, and he also kind of equates that to how greatly he was respected in the community, where he had a position of community leadership, and that others looked up to him and looked for him for assistance and help in all things. He describes how his reputation for wisdom and goodness was deserved. In his former confidence, Job felt that he would die happy and secure in his nest after a good life. And these verses kind of highlight the tremendous contrast between the former esteem that he enjoyed and the terrible criticism that he has endured from his friends. There was a time when no one would have criticized Job the way that his friends are doing it now. And Job was a tremendous example of how a wealthy and powerful person should live his and her life, not in selfish indulgence, but in care and concern for the less fortunate. And as I was writing this, I was thinking of some recent current events where somebody of great wealth and that kind of stuff was using their money, and it's kind of a real sidetrack off of our discussion here. But have anybody heard about what happened to Lady Gaga this week?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, her prized French bulldogs were taken, 2 of them. And so she puts out a $500,000 no questions asked reward for the return of her bulldogs. And part of me thinks that, okay, it's great that you've got that kind of money, but isn't that a really selfish waste of wealth that's not in line with what God would expect out of us? I mean, any of us would go out and buy another dog and then donate the rest to build a church or do something. But I mean, it's great that you've got the capability to do that, but I think it spoke a lot more about her than it did the thieves, to be quite honest. So
Well, I was thinking in that situation, she didn't even bother to mention reward to try to find who shot the
God,
dog walker.
shot her dog walker,
Yeah.
in the chest of all things.
Right.
Yeah, he holds a press conference and I want my dogs back. That's about all she said.
Yeah.
So yeah,
So did
You
she
know-
get the dogs back? This is all new to us. We don't know this story.
Yes.
All I know is that one of them didn't get stolen. There was 3 dogs there. They took 2 of them. Now I haven't heard whether she got the dogs back or not.
I
But
think she got the dogs back.
okay.
And the dog walker died or did not die?
Did not.
Did not die, from what I understood. That he's in the hospital, obviously.
I did not realize the reward. I heard that there was a reward, but I thought that was for who shot the dog walker. I didn't know it was to get her dogs back.
No, it was for no questions asked. Well, yeah, I mean, why she even used the words "no questions asked." I want my dogs back. I'll give somebody $500,000.
Mhm.
And so you wouldn't use the term "no questions asked" for her friend or her employee, so to speak.
True.
And this kind of reminds me the whole thing that the entertainment industry and all that kind of stuff is great, but I think sometimes people really get carried away. And does a performer work harder than an engineer or a pharmacist or an insurance salesman or any other business person? Probably not. A farmer, but yet they get all the rewards and the accolades and the publicity. And that's part of the problem with society nowadays, is because they can sing a good note, they get more of a voice in politics and real life than the rest of us sometimes. And it's just kind of sad, though, that money is like sports. Sometimes it reveals character more than it creates it. So anyway, I've digressed long enough on that topic today.
Well, she did get her dogs back yesterday, by the way.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
cost her 500,000.
That I'm not finding.
Well, and supposedly these dogs are only worth about $9,000 on the open market anyway. So what has she done? She has effectively made it okay for people to say, okay, I'm going to go out and steal other people's dogs and try to get the reward. It's just enabled it for more crimes of this nature to happen. Okay, I'm done.
That's true.
They're with you.
Okay,
Yeah,
so chapter
I have
29,
I have
Go
to
ahead.
ask a question. When Job is citing the things that his heart, that were in his heart, that had been in his heart as he has grown older, was any of that a source of pride? Because
Well, I
when you read it, it sounds like it could be interpreted that way.
Well, I think to some degree now that's what chapter 29 is trying to explain, that yeah, these he's looking back now at the good times and the positive days, whether or not he really showed that prior to this. He's definitely recognizing it now that yeah, life was a lot different. Now, is he doing it as a gloat or a source of pride, or is he doing it to offset his friends' arguments at this point? Um,
Good point.
I think he could be using it because this question here says, explain how Job's description of his past conduct contrasted to how his friends describe him. His friends said that he stole from people, he was a thief, he didn't care about the widows and the orphans or the poor. Maybe now that made Job reflect and goes, well, wait a minute. No, I've always treated, and I don't want to get into too many deals because I think he kind of wraps it up in 31 a little bit, but I guess you've kind of opened up the door to this question here is, okay, why was Job using these words, and how do they contrast? And so what is the point that he's really trying to make here?
I think he's making it because he is a true friend of God, and he did follow the precepts given to him by the Lord. So he's defending himself.
Yeah, and in so many words, he's defending himself against probably his friends more than anything, because with Job being a true believer and stuff, and God is an omniscient God who sees, Job has repeatedly said God sees everything. His friends said, well, maybe God doesn't see everything. Job is a believer that God knows all and sees all and allows things to happen. So he knows that God already knows all this stuff, but he's using this in so many words to defend himself against his friends and anybody else that would continue to condemn him, I think.
Well, and he says too, he said, I was always praised because I helped the poor, I helped the widows. If you go back to chapter 22, Eliphaz says, oh, no, you didn't, or did your question if he did. So I think, again, he's still trying to reiterate, I was a decent person.
Yeah.
I think that's where he's making this case too, that, the young people kind of revered him and stayed out of his way, and the other people came to him for advice and everything, and the servants and everybody respected him as well too. Those are not the actions of people that don't like the way they're being treated by somebody. So yep. So let's hit chapter 30 here real quick too. So then Job just got through reflecting on the good times. So now he's going to reflect a little bit on his misery. And it says Job is tortured by the irony of all of this. It's like, and he uses not only the men, but the sons of the men whom Job compared to dogs were now his mockers and critics. And, if you've been in any of our previous Bible studies, what is the lowliest animal on the face of the earth in biblical times? It's a dog. Today's exactly the opposite, as we just talked about. Dogs are more precious than gold. But it's like not only were the people that worked for him mocking him, but their children were mocking him. And normally, children are taught to respect the elders, no matter how the adults would talk to them. But Job kind of thought that a lot of these worthless men were now his loud critics, and it really didn't seem right that they were in a position to be able to shun him, throw rocks at him, talk down to him and things. He mourned this a lot because he really, liked, he kind of compared it to when he was respected and honored. But again, throughout this chapter, even though he's talking about, his misery from men, the worst aspect of what he feels like he's suffering is the sense that God has forsaken him. And even though he describes, his persistent pain and gnawing pains in his skin and his afflictions and everything, it was still more of a crisis of his soul. He's more worried about his soul and his justification and redemption. When's it going to happen? More so than his pain and his physical mortal time on earth. So question 30, we only got one question here. It says chapters 29 and 30 contrast Job's prior happiness and his present suffering. More specifically, they describe the honor he once enjoyed and the contempt he is now subject to. Now, the question is, does this radical change in social standing give us a clue as to what Job wants from God? And this question says, and why, or I would even add, and if not, why? Any thoughts on what is he truly, what is he seeking and why?
Wants to go back and be in good standing with God again. And he'll show that much stronger as we go through this book.
Yeah, I think he's using the past and the present to kind of describe the differences and everything, but I don't think he's as worried about his social standing. I mean, I think he would like to at least have a little bit of a justification in his status with God for himself, but I to some degree, is that as important to him? Is having the mortal people on earth knowing about him being right with God as important as him being right with God? It's hard to tell from these two chapters or whatever. But again, I think Job's more wanting his face to face, more or less. Yeah. And he would rather his face to face and being back in God's good graces be while he's a mortal before he goes on to the afterlife, I think. But not to prove it to anybody but himself. Anybody have a different take on that? I guess the message here is a lot of times we do things, or we put on appearances sometimes because we don't want our neighbors, our friends, or anybody else out there to think ill of us and that kind of stuff. Maybe sometimes today we put too much emphasis on what other people think rather than what God thinks. And maybe that's the lesson here, is that, Job's trying to teach us that it doesn't matter what other people think. It's what God thinks of us. And that's the one and only entity. Now, I will say it's hard to be sometimes right in the church and that kind of stuff if some people do think ill of you. Don't get me wrong. But that's usually a reflection on them more than it is you if you're in the right. So, hearing no other commentary, we got about 5 minutes here. Chapter 31. This is starting to get down to the final argument. In chapter 31, Job is making his final oath, his final claim to innocence. And it's his final and explicit answer to all of the arguments and accusations that have been made by his friends. And in the beginning, Job kind of talks about how he has been a godly and blameless man, at least on a human scale. He's talking about his interactions and his relations with others and what he has done, what he hasn't done. But when he's talking about the things that he has not done because they wouldn't be godly, he's not saying it more as in it's I just avoided doing those things. He states that he made a vow or a covenant to remain pure. And interestingly, the 10 commandments and the covenants with Christ hadn't really been written yet or put on stone. So Job was trying to lead and abide by a lot of these commandments and stuff before they were ever given to man yet. So Job also asks and concludes that there's one sentence in there, or a verse about the acceptable allotment. So Job's more or less claiming that seeing his own wife is the only acceptable allotment and inheritance from God, that all other women are other people's wives and they belong to God and to these other men, and they're not his to look at. So he's putting a lot of this into the context of self-control. He considers the destructive nature that if one does get led astray or to do some of these less than activities and stuff, that they can lead to the destruction of that person. But he's firmly stating that he never did any of those things. Therefore, he shouldn't be punished, and he still swears he's innocent in that way. And like we said, Job knew that God's eye was upon him at all times. He never once thought, like the people in the thieves in the night that we talked about, that I can get away with this in the dark because God can't see me. Job knew that God was there at all times. Job also proclaimed his blameless life because he lived an essentially truthful life. He didn't steal. He didn't lie to anybody. He didn't do anything, of a false nature, so to speak. And he wasn't afraid to call a curse upon himself if he was not an honest man. He said, if there's several times he goes, if I have ever done any of these things, let the wrath come, let it come down on me. I'm willing to accept my punishment if I did these things. But he's still holding his integrity, and he's also claiming to be faithful, not only to other men and other people, but also to his wife within the marriage. And so Job continues the presentation of his own righteousness. He notes the good and compassionate treatment of his servants. He talks about servants. He recognizes that they're basically humans, the same as he is. He mentions that I came from the womb, they came from the womb. He doesn't give them a place where he would treat them any differently than he would his wives or his sons. And this was basically admirable in that time, because as we all know, it was pretty much traditional of those times that understood that servants and slaves a lot of times were considered subhuman next to those to whom they served. They were treated just like the animals, and some were even treated like the dogs and stuff that surrounded the communities as well. And in wrapping up, as a further testimony to his righteousness, Job insists that he has been good and kind to the poor and to the helpless. There's several references in there where he's helped them, he's clothed them, he's given them places to stay. He insists that greed or other forms of worship have not been his guide in any of his actions. And so as further testimony to his righteousness, he claims that he has not cursed his enemies, even when he had an opportunity. to curse his enemies. He did not do so. And he has been hospitable to travelers that have come through the area. This one verse in there I really thought was interesting, though. It says, Job proclaimed that he had not covered up his sins like Adam had, or had been accused by his three friends. So this is probably one of the first references in the Bible in the chapter of Job about other people or Adam himself. And since the thought is that Job was probably the first book of the Bible ever written, you wonder here, did Job really know about Adam? Did all of those stories carry through time, or was this maybe the author who wrote this in there? But it's the way it's written. These were Job's words, the way it's written. So I thought that was kind of interesting and curious that we've got a reference to Adam, who was in Genesis, and at the fact that he had tried to cover up his sins and not open up, and then even when his sins were revealed, he found the need to blame someone else. But still, Job was so sure of his innocence that he said, I'm willing to put my mark on it. He's willing to sign anything or enter into a contract or an agreement. And he kind of challenges God that if you've got something to blame me for, write it down and charge me. And then Job basically stops talking. He's done arguing his case in chapter 31.
You have
so the question. Go ahead, Keith.
You have several ifs and lets there. If he has done this, then let this happen. And I think he is just confident that he has not done any of those. And
Right.
That's what he's expressing.
Yeah. If there's a few places we've seen this that it says, if he were guilty of any of these things, would he have put this stuff out there? Nowadays it's hard to get away with anything, between witnesses and cameras and GPS, knowing where your car is and all that kind of stuff. But back then, integrity was everything. And the guilty person wouldn't stand up and say, hey, if you can prove I stole this, then whatever. The truly good people wouldn't take that chance, so to speak.
Right.
Now,
Good
I've got
point,
a
Keith.
comment about the covenant that Job had with his eyes. In my commentary, it says, comparing the world of a man in 1500 with the man in the year 2000. In 1500, the average age of a man's economic independence was 16. Today, it's 26. In 1500, the average age of a marriage for a man was 18. Today, 28. And in 1500, the average age of male puberty was 20. Today, it's 12. And all these are because of the sexualization of society. I thought that was interesting to see the comparisons, how much we've changed with technology and the temptations and the sin that's available to us.
Yeah, and David, I read that same commentary, and had I not read that, I might have disputed some of that a little bit to some degree, because I remember things like the boy kings and some of those kind of things. I mean, some of those in the ancient times, sometimes people were led into manhood at a much earlier age and that kind of stuff. I mean, sometimes they died at the age of 28, let alone, got married at the age of 28 and 18. So, I was still a little bit confused with some of those claims and statements, but you're definitely right about the whole, what does society do to our young kids and that kind of stuff now. That is definitely for certain. Um, But yeah, I felt like, sometimes in ancient times you had to grow up sooner than you really needed to, because you couldn't play and stuff and goof off until you were 24. Like, sorry, Logan, kids do. just kidding. You're a hardworking man, but you're the exception rather than the rule. Let's put it that way. There are a lot of people today that, still at the age when kids were getting married before, there's people that still don't know what they want to do with their life today. So I think
I'm the same way. I'm 65. I'll be 66 in April. Yeah, I'm still that way. Trying to figure out what I'm going to do.
what you want to do when you grow up. Well, let's finish up these last two questions. We're running a little bit long. Job inserts his integrity early in chapter 27, and then in this chapter, he calls down God's wrath if he ever harmed anyone. Why didn't he say all this earlier during the debate? Well, I summarized it that he didn't because no one up until now had accused him of anything. God hadn't accused him of anything. I mean, Job has been asking all along, what have I done? And it was only into the third speeches of Eliphaz and Bildad that they said, well, okay, Job, you want to know what? You did this and this and this. And then it was like, it was a huge surprise to Job. It's like, nobody's accused me of anything ever. So he didn't know he had to defend himself of these things because nobody, God or mortal, had accused him of it until now. So that's why he's speaking up now, I think. And then the final question in verse 31, verse 26 through 28, what had Job avoided doing, and why would this have been considered a sin against God? And in those three verses, he specifically mentions a few things that you kind of got to get into the interpretation a little bit. Let me read it to you. This is the New King James Version. If I have observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart had been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, thus would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above. So has anybody made the connection about what he's talking about here?
I think he's talking about worshiping something other than God, or going to something other than God to ask for help.
Absolutely right. Yeah, in ancient times, a lot of times people gave a lot of credit to false gods and false idols. They did worship the sun and the moon, and they would beg for certain things to help their crops and that kind of stuff. I was trying to get a grasp of what he meant by kissing his hand. So what I found is that sometimes when you couldn't go to an idol and kiss the idol and worship the idol, that you would kiss the back of your hand or your fingers or whatever, and that was your way of paying homage to these false gods or false idols. And so he's saying, I've never ever worshipped a false entity. And again, I think this kind of is a reference to would have been the breaking of the number one covenant, very first covenant in the 10 Commandments. And that is no worshiping of false gods. So, okay. That concludes chapter 31. Anybody else have any other comments, things to add, questions? Well, next week we're going to hit chapters 32, 33, and 34. Again, those are not in our study guide. I'll send out some questions again, but then the week after that, we will get back into our study guide. Sorry, it ran a little bit long today. We got off early last week. Hopefully everybody still makes it to church on time. Keith, do you mind closing us out today, please?
Okay. Father, thank you again for this time that we've spent in the book of Job, trying to understand more what it has to tell us for our lives. Thank you for being our Father, and thank you now for going with us. In Jesus' name, amen.
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 Great week.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
See you guys.
See you.
See you guys.